Welcome everyone to our webinar for the Early Childhood and Early Care and Education Special Interest Group of the International Society for Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity. My name is Dr. Anne Martin. I'm the chair of the Early Care and Education Special Interest Group, and I am delighted to welcome you to a hopefully very thought-provoking discussion on screen time in early childhood education, good, bad, or both. And I'm going to give you a very brief introduction and some housekeeping notes. So on this next slide, you see the webinar system. So we are using Zoom, and you are all automatically muted. And if you have a question, and we take questions throughout the presentations, but actually we're going to collate all the questions and then come back to them after the two speakers presented their talk. And then we're going to have a discussion at the end. So please fire away whenever you have a question in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your of the webinar system. So what is this webinar about? So it's all about the screens and digital media, and there is some, let's say, there are two divided parts, let's say, in the field. So some say, yeah, it's good because it can support learning. Others say, no, maybe no, it's not good for health and well-being. So our two fantastic speakers are gonna present both stands. So Professor Sonia Livingston will will talk us through potential benefits of why we should use digital media, and for 20 minutes, Professor Sonia Livingston will talk. And then Assistant Professor Christy Adam will talk about why we maybe should be a bit more considerate when it comes to using digital media in early childhood education settings. And then after the 20 minutes, or 40 minutes in total, 20 minutes each, Professor Stuart Trost will take your questions and ask the questions, and both speakers, Sonia and Christy, will discuss them. So, and I guess now I'm handing over to Professor Sonia Livingston.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And I am just going to find my slides, and okay, good. So I'm a social psychologist, and I've been researching families' changing engagement with media and digital technologies for the past 30 years. And my focus is on the meanings, values, and practices of families in the face of societal change, technological innovation and complexity, and the commercial and regulatory agendas which drive those conditions for families. And today I'm arguing on the pro side, but I want to acknowledge from the start that there is a lot we don't know, because technology is changing fast, because it takes 20 years for a child to grow up, so we see how they turn out. And by the time we've learned our lessons from them, the tech has already changed. So, we are witnessing a transformation of childhood. The figures I've put up on the screen for 3 to 4-year-olds and 5 to 7-year-olds come from a recent report by the UK's communication regulator, and they've just been published. And I really think they do show a transformation of childhood. Childhood is now heavily mediated, and parents, among others, are acquiring new technology and embedding it in family lives at a rapid rate. So why are parents doing this, especially given a climate of concern? In my research on a project called Parenting for Digital Future, I did a national survey of UK parents, and I asked them just this question. And what was clear is that parents believe that the digital future is important, that it's not going away, that children must somehow learn, cope, and thrive within the digital world. And more than that, parents themselves are now digital natives. 2/3 of parents in my survey use the internet to learn and to support their child's learning. For many, digital media offer a form of family togetherness, a means of sharing experiences, a way of talking about the world and their interests, and a really vital way of connecting with friends and family. When we criticize parents for too much screen time or call on them to do other things, I also invite us to think exactly what we expect of parents. In many countries, in mine certainly, children and youth services have been cut in the last years. Playgrounds are often underfunded or absent. Parents fear the streets are not safe for play. And in short, for many parents, it's difficult to get out, activities are expensive, and those with small children are often made to feel unwelcome in public places. And by comparison, digital technologies are appealing, relatively affordable for the hours of entertainment that they provide, and engaging with them is normative. Everyone is doing it. So in our research, we found that parents were embracing digital technologies in their children's lives with enthusiasm, but ambivalence. They welcome the opportunities, they worry about the risks. They are told all the time they should feel guilty about screen time, and they do. But in practice, we find that many are using digital technologies and digital activities as a kind of space in which they can impart their values, their interests, their expectations of their children, including discipline. And frankly, it's just a way of getting through the multiple demands of the day. So every day, it seems that the headlines scream at parents, at all of us. Screen time is bad. It's causing all the problems that children suffer. Parents should get a grip. They should police their children. They should control. They should ban. They should spy. They should monitor, and they should restrict. But the science behind these headlines is increasingly being questioned. And I've showed you here some alternative headlines also beginning to emerge, which are questioning the injunction that parents should always be acting like the police, controlling their children, and recognizing that in a digital world, it's better to encourage parents and encourage children to engage with screen media sensibly, responsibly, and with attention not to the time, but to the content and the context and the specific needs and circumstances of each child. And this emerging vision, I think, fits better with the ethos in families, because parenting is no longer a matter of the authoritarian imposition of power by the Victorian father. It's increasingly a matter of negotiation, recognition of mutual rights and interests, and a focus on open and trusting relationships. So yes, engaging with digital technologies in the home can be stressful, especially around digital media, and parents are struggling with this. But my point is, what parents need here is guidance and support, not criticism. So I want to try to be brave now and play you a video that was taken by a friend who has given me permission to show you this. Okay, it's a home video, you get the idea. Let me move back to my presentation. So I don't want to say that children are always dancing about as they watch media, but they are sometimes. And there's a long history of research on families and media which shows how children interact with, play with, and are active around media. So I use this little video to say that screen use is not always sedentary, passive, antisocial, harmful. And all our talk about measuring time really fails to consider these key points. So you may still be dissatisfied and want some more science. And I think for many people, that image of a child staring at a screen, sedentary and still for hours, lost to the world, haunts us. And people keep asking, what about their sleep? What about their eyesight, their lack of exercise, their contact with strangers, their exposure to violence or advertising? So recently, the UK government, worried about obesity and physical activity, like many, reviewed all the research literature, building on recent work in Canada, Australia, and America. And I sat on the 0 to 5 age group, working group. So it very quickly became clear that the scientific literature is particularly weak in relation to screen time. So we have large national studies of children's obesity, and they tend to include just one very simple measure of screen time, often an overall estimate of time. For older studies, it's mainly based on television still. And the assumption is that all screen use is sedentary, and I've not seen any or very few studies that distinguish the kind of content that children are engaged with. Is it educational? What is the context of use? What are the children getting from it? Even so, screen use is generally the smallest part of an explanation for any problem that children face, whether it's problems with sleep or with obesity, whatever else. So if children sleep well, get exercise, interact with others, then there's generally no problem for screen time to explain. And so obviously parents need to be advised about sleep, health, diet, exercise, etc., but screen time, I suggest, is not the issue. So at the UK government, we concluded that the government's accepted all the recommendations, but even our very tentative suggestions that maybe screen time could have adverse effects on sleep were not accepted. So what do we know, and what can research tell us? What we know, and what I see in my research, is that screen time leads to conflict within the home. And what I found fascinating is how much parents talk about screen time as the conflict rather than conflict over particular contents or context, especially for young children. We know that children are a far from homogeneous category, and it does damage even to call them all just children. So for families who are divided by across countries, for children who have special educational needs or disabilities, for a host of other reasons, screen media can be seen as a lifeline, and families will organize themselves around those uses. Banning or restricting technology on the grounds of time, therefore, fails to acknowledge all the effort that is now going into building educational apps and digital resources to develop children's digital media creativity. Much of that targeted to help reach children whose life is lacking in other opportunities. So I have to say, we don't know which of these educational or creative apps works very well as yet. We don't know the long-term consequences of those either, so more evaluation is needed. And parents, as I've heard many times, don't really know what to choose, how to decide which are the apps, which are the contents that are going to be beneficial for them. So they need more guidance, absolutely. But that is the direction that I suggest that research henceforth should take. So as part of a different project I was in, which was called DigiLitty, and it was really focused on the positive, but also the varied and diverse ways in which children engaged with digital technology in lots of different countries and in lots of different ways and in lots of different kinds of families. We spent some years kind of pooling our insights about all the benefits and harms, and we put them into what we called a smart parenting guide for the digital age. And I just want to kind of end by showing you a sense of what that guide includes. And what you'll see is that we're really trying to kind of translate the advice, translate the research into advice for parents. And behind each element, there is a kind of set of resources, and it's designed to be supportive and enabling and to point parents out, rather than, as it were, telling them always to look at their watch, always to kind of feel criticized themselves and to criticize their child. What is it that the research suggests that we should do? Okay, well, it says, number one, understand your child's digital world. And I think a lot of the studies don't really think about what it is that parents themselves know about the digital world and how they can draw on that knowledge. A lot of the advice assumes that parents are, as it were, ignorant or too simple in the complex digital world. Their children understand better. Parents are constantly being told that children know better and that they are disempowered. What we invite them to do instead is to find ways in which they can be empowered. And many of these people are using digital technology, social media for work, for their social life, for their blogging, for a host of reasons. Number two, shape your child's online experience. And here we really wanted to recognize the incredible diversity of ways in which families are in practice engaging with digital media. Having spent the last few years going into one home after the next, and asking parents, what are they trying to do? What are they achieving? Why are the activities as they are? How does the media fit into their day? You really see how very different parents' experiences are and family life around digital media is. And again, if we can find ways to kind of invite families to feel empowered around that shaping of their child's digital experience according to their values, according to their knowledge, according to their interests, then we move beyond that sense that parents have got to do the same as everyone else, and if they're doing anything different, they're somehow deviant and it's problematic. Number two, share, learn and play together. So this was something that I really enjoyed finding in the research. We are constantly being told that digital media is taking everyone apart onto their own screen, in their own separate worlds. No one is ever paying attention to anyone else anymore. What we saw is that some of that is happening, but also many families are using digital media as the way they can come together, the way they can share something, whether it's kind of curling up and watching a video together at the weekend, or whether it's dads playing computer games sometimes, not to be biased, but that's often the story we were told. Finding ways for families to share. They are looking for these opportunities, and if they're sharing together, then those children are precisely getting what I think the developmental psychologists want them to have, which is the interaction with family, the engagement with people of different ages, the opportunities for everyone to kind of respond and interact and engage with each other. Next, yes, stay healthy and safe online. So of course this is important, and this is where I would point to questions about content and context, because staying safe or unsafe or the risks online can come from many different sources, and by and large it's not the time, but the balance in the life, the particular kinds of content or games or contact that children might be exposed to, the particular kinds of violence or advertising that they might be exposed to. All of these things, of course, parents need to keep an eye on, and all of these things they need support and guidance to manage better, and sometimes we also need regulation. But this is kind of really getting down into the particularities of modes of engagement, and that's where parents need to be empowered to make the judgments, not, as it were, just to feel it's all bad. And last, stay in touch, stay up to date. This can be a plus rather than a negative, the sense that we're all going out of date and that the children are always using the latest app that is somehow undermining can be overcome. If it becomes fun, people can stay up to date together. And of course, parents do need to. So that's pretty much me. I'm trying to kind of keep my comments embedded in everyday life, in the real circumstances of real life families, in all their diversity, and to recognise the digital is indeed here to stay. And there are many pluses and many missed opportunities regarding those pluses yet to be explored. And somehow that's the direction we have to go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. And now it's time for Assistant Professor Christy Adam.
In this argument. So Dr. Livingston has told us all sorts of wonderful stuff about screen time, and I don't disagree with many of the things that she said, but I'm taking a sensationalized other side of this story. So have you ever seen a preschooler trying to swipe right on a magazine page or to touch a picture looking for interaction? Have you been in a public place like a park, a community center, or a coffee shop? If so, you've probably seen a gang of zombie-like faces staring at glowing screens of tablets and smartphones. This is bad news. This is bad news because evidence is mounting that screen time leads to brain damage. Yes, I said it, a loss of brain cells, and on its heels, other issues such as inattention, delayed developmental milestones, struggles with social interaction, screen dependency disorder, and addiction. By exposing kids to screen time in the early years, we're heading down these slippery slopes. According to researchers at the University of Iowa, by age 2, 90% of today's children have a moderate ability to use a tablet. I just learned how to use a tablet a couple of years ago. Heart of England Foundation Trust Study reports that too much technology has resulted in children with weak hands and fingers, who when they enter kindergarten have a hard time holding onto a pencil. Data from the 2018 ChildWise Monitor report says that there are more toddlers with their own devices than without. Psychologists are also reporting that they're treating children as young as 3 for screen addiction. And I have witnessed enough toddler meltdowns to know that this is a real thing. Sadly, with this enslavement to screens, outdoor time is dwindling. Researchers from the Dirt is Good initiatives were able to identify that children now spend less time outdoors than folks who are in jail. This was a survey that researched 12,000 parents spanning 10 countries, as indicated below. Going outside can be challenging. I get it. I'm from Canada. We experience an 80-degree temperature change, 80 degrees Celsius. Getting kids ready to go out and play in the snow is really, really challenging, and slathering kids with sunscreen is also a challenge. But come on, this is a sorry state of affairs. An alarming new study has revealed that indoor screen time has replaced outdoor play for the majority of children in the UK and Ireland. And this is from a survey of about 1,000 parents that found that children by the age of 7 will have spent 2.5 times as long sitting alone in front of a screen than engaging in outdoor play. And as you can see, the industry revenue from the gaming industry far outweighs that from the playground industry. And this is a quite recent phenomenon. So I understand that screen time, as Dr. Livingston said, can be very engaging and educational if it's used appropriately. They can certainly serve an educational purpose. But you know who didn't have access to a tablet? Albert Einstein, Edward Jenner, Thomas Edison, Marie Curie, and Rosalind Franklin. If they hadn't been able to focus without distraction, we wouldn't be having this debate at all. Instead, we would be sitting in the dark with no knowledge of physics, chemistry, or genetics, and dying of preventable diseases. Wait, thanks to the anti-vax movement, largely brought to you by propagation of misinformation shared through social media, a highly ubiquitous byproduct of screen time, we sort of are dying from preventable diseases. Are we seeing a rise in screen time zombies? I would say yes. Why do we care? Well, this is my field. According to the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, the first 2,000 days represent a critical period of growth and development. So as this includes time in the womb, which is about 270 days, this gets us to conception to about 4.5 years. The types of stimuli infants and children are exposed to help shape the brain and behavior. A large proportion of postnatal brain development is experience dependent, and the brain is much more sensitive to experience in the first few years of life than in later years. So the sensory and perceptual systems critical to language, social behavior, and emotion are built in the early years and are strongly influenced by experiences during this time. According to neurobiologists, the brain of infants triple in size between birth and 2 years. The brain's plasticity is bountiful during the early years, and a parent's voice, their touch, and eventually play can help build pathways in their brain that aid them in learning how to bond emotionally with other people. Children in the early years need stimuli from their real-life environment to develop cognitive skills. The imagery we were all required to conjure when listening to a story has now been replaced by pictures, sounds, and videos on a digital device, allowing one's brain to get lazy. Devices offer children instant gratification, which can contribute to a lack of emotional control, behavior issues related to attention, impatience, and frustration. Not only children, but adults as well. So research has shown that too much time on smartphones or tablets is detrimental to cognition, developmental outcomes, behavior, social skills, motor skills, sleep patterns, and mental health. In this first study by Horowitz-Kras, parental surveys and magnetic resonance imaging scans were used to compare time spent using screen-based media or reading on the functional connectivity of reading-related brain regions in children between the ages of 8 and 12. Screen time and time spent reading showed different effects, with greater reported reading time being associated with an increased functional connectivity in the reading-related brain networks in children. These results underscore the importance of reading to support healthy brain development and literacy, and limiting screen-based media use. Emotional understanding is our ability to understand, predict, and explain our own emotions, as well as those of others. In this study of approximately 2,500 parents and children from a set of Norwegian birth cohorts, more screen time at age 4 predicted lower levels of emotional understanding. In this study by fellow Canadians, Madigan et al., they looked at whether or not screen time was associated with child development in over 2,000 mother-child dyads from the All in Our Family study. Development was assessed using the Ages and Stages questionnaire and looked at factors such as growth in communication, motor skills, problem solving, personal social skills. The average amount of screen time for children in the 24-month, 36-month, and 60-month time range is shown here. It equates to about 2.4, 3.6, and 1.6 hours per day. The researchers found that greater screen time at 24 months was associated with poorer performance on developmental screening tests at 36 months, and greater screen time at 36 months was associated with lower scores on developmental screening tests at 60 months. So data from one of the largest birth cohorts here in Canada, called CHILD, examined screen type exposure on problem behavior in preschoolers using the Child Behavior Checklist. So screen time above the 2-hour threshold at 5 years was associated with an increased risk of clinically relevant externalizing morbidity, and specifically inattention problems. Really, all this goes to say is that the association between screen time and problem behaviors was greater than any other risks, including sleep, parenting stress, and socioeconomic factors, which were all taken into account. We know that socialization skills have always been an important part of communication and supporting one's ability to belong. But digital devices and social media have reduced the need for face-to-face interaction. Do you remember when you were young and you were forced to practice these skills? I do. My parents used to force me to talk to my aunts and uncles that I was afraid of or I felt nervous talking to, or I had to play with my cousins who I wasn't overly enamored with, or I had to go and knock on my neighbors' doors and ask the kids to come out and play. Instead, more and more of today's children find themselves in a vicious cycle. Social awkwardness, retreating to screens, not learning, and losing communication skills, and continued social awkwardness. This can lead to exclusion and loneliness and seeking further screen time for pleasure. In the early years, we all know that social interaction is critical. The brain's frontal lobe, which houses structures supporting the ability to empathize, to read body language, to understand facial expressions and social cues, Developing all of these sorts of skills is important so that people can understand social situations and be able to act appropriately. And the thought is that some of these changes that are occurring might be permanent. When it comes to motor skills, something sort of near and dear to my heart, in a study done in Louisiana by colleagues at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, they used 126 3- and 4-year-olds, looked at a prospective trial, and they were able to show that children's motor skills were positively related to vigorous physical activity, but inversely related to screen time. And we know that physical activity is associated with all sorts of positive growth and development in children, particularly those at this age. When it comes to sleep patterns, as was mentioned before, well, this isn't the only study, but this study used over 1,000 toddlers, and it found an association between daily tablet and smartphone uses and sleep quality. Essentially, everyday use of a tablet or smartphone raised the odds of a shorter sleep time by almost 2-fold, and a longer sleep onset latency by 2.2-fold. And this was irrespective of other factors such as temperament, that's restlessness and sociability, or traditional screen exposure, that's like watching TV or video games. So as Sonia said, splitting these up is actually quite important. When it comes to mental health, dopamine is a neurotransmitter whose signaling is associated with reward-motivated behavior. This is released by the hypothalamus, and it plays a role in controlling when and how much we eat, sleep, move, learn, and maintain attention. When people are triggered by external stimuli, so this could be a children's game, it could be a video, it could be multiple different things, or things more sinister like methamphetamine, dopamine is going to flood our brain centers, our pleasurable brain centers, signaling that what we are doing is good and that we should seek more of it, hence the potential for addiction. This is a term derived from Latin meaning enslaved by or bound to. In essence, our children are enslaved by screens. So to understand how screen time might affect development in the language centers of the brain, a provocative study out of Cincinnati gave MRIs to 47 preschool-age children. And they found that more screen time meant lower expressive language, less ability to rapidly name objects, and decreased literacy skills. There were also physical changes to the brain. Specifically, lower brain white matter integrity was impaired in a portion of the brain. And these are the portions that impact language and literacy. So the authors note a clear link between higher screen use and lower white matter integrity in the children that they studied. Similarly, other studies that have looked at cortical thinning or gray matter also are showing problems. So what is cortical thinning? As a middle-aged woman, I really don't want to hear the word thinning unless we're talking about my thighs or my hips. But cortical thinning essentially relates to changes in the structure of the cerebral cortex, and it's normally associated with aging, memory loss, or other cognitive impairments. So there's been a large study funded by the NIH called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Project, and it's following over 11,000 children through adolescence. And over this time, they're conducting MRI imaging. The preliminary results have found significant differences in the brains of some children who report using smartphones, tablets, and video games for an excessive period of time, about 7 hours a day. Although these results are preliminary, heavy screen users did show premature cortical thinning. And they scored lower on some aptitude tests than children who had less screen time. It was not just excessive screen users that were implicated, but children who reported only 2 hours of screen time also got lower scores on thinking and aptitude tests. The possible links between excessive screen time and attention deficit, mood disorders, and learning difficulties are also being investigated in this ABCD study. Similar studies examining adolescents with screen addiction have shown atrophy, that's shrinkage or loss of volume, in gray matter areas. So gray matter areas are the areas that are involved in processing, and they're included in the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe it basically governs executive functions, planning and prioritizing, organizing, and some of impulse control as well. So of note, there's also an area called the insula, which is involved in our capacity to develop empathy and compassion, and our ability to integrate these sort of signals. And this was found to be negatively impacted as well in these studies. Research has also demonstrated a loss of integrity to the brain's white matter, similar to the study that I showed before by Hutton. And some of these white matter tracts are important for brain regions to talk to one another. So while I recognize that these studies were not in preschoolers, if 40 is the new 20, then teens are definitely the new toddlers. So, in conclusion, With the early introduction of screens, are we creating a generation of screen time zombies? Zombies, like our screen-engaged kids, display limited social interaction, indicative of frontal lobe impairment. They lack fine motor skills, and they display jerky, uncoordinated movements, implicating the motor cortex. Their rudimentary communication indicates impairments with white matter. So these are all attributes and brain regions associated with screen time. In zombies, like with screen time dependent youth, the only working part of the brain region appears to be the hypothalamus, the brain's appetite and dopamine responsive center, which explains their insatiable appetite for human flesh and unstoppable nature. So anyone who has seen a good zombie apocalypse movie knows that the only way to stop a zombie is to sever the connection between their brain and their body. So if you are against cannibalism and decapitation and support literacy, empathy, and emotional control, then you are clearly anti-screen time in early childhood education. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm Professor Stuart Trost, and I'm moderating today's discussion. And first, I just want to thank the presenters for two really exciting, provoking presentations. So, we have a number of questions that I would like to present to both presenters, or give both presenters. And the first question that I'd like to present is aimed primarily at Professor Livingston. And can you say something, and this is from Amanda Taylor Bestwick, and she asks, can you say something about the role, if any, of compulsory education or any relevant profession in nurturing appropriate digital usage?
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. That's an interesting question. So I've spent some time thinking about the kinds of role that teachers, educators, working in whatever level can play, and also some of the other professions who support families, like health visitors and social workers and so forth. And I think one anxiety I have is that they very often have, by the time the advice kind of filters through their professional associations and reaches those different professions, because they don't have a lot of time for training and updates, they're often getting kind of an out-of-date account of the challenge. So I've heard a lot of the kind of old advice from the American Academy of Pediatrics kind of finding its way through what teachers or health visitors and others know, actually parents as well, but not necessarily the new advice, which in fact has moved away from simply saying 2 hours, that's your max, to saying, you know, as I would be more inclined to agree, think more about the mix and what that that the digital media are part of in the broader pattern of interactions that a child gets. So clearly, educators can play a really key role in supporting that kind of interaction that children really do need, as Christy said too, and they can play a role in identifying which are the beneficial apps, which are the beneficial activities, what kinds of contents, because I think so many people are just at sea, and there's a very, very significant marketplace which is trying to kind of tell us what is beneficial with dubious, let's say, at best, kind of claims about effectiveness. So I think if educators could play that role in kind of mediating so that people had some criteria to judge content by or interactions by, that would be fantastic. I don't know that that's happening a lot yet. I think educators are probably pretty busy people with their own agenda, but I would love them to see them do more kind of nuanced guidance about how to make those judgments, because ultimately parents, especially of young children, have to make a lot of judgments.
Right.
Interestingly enough, if I can just touch on this, not my area of expertise, but here in Ontario, Canada right now, our teachers are striking. And one of the reasons why they're striking is because our government, our provincial government, is trying to implement required digital courses for all children to have to take. So they're going to replace some of the courses in schools. And there's a big kerfuffle essentially about how that would work, how it would be monitored, how we would mediate it, etc. So it's interesting that this is playing out here in Canada right now.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question here from L.I. Constoli, and I'll preface it by saying that the question is really about the reference that you had, Christy, about how outdoor time spent outdoors declines with screen time increasing. So Ellie is interested in the reference for that, but maybe more broadly say something a little bit about that literature in terms of maybe going back to Sonia's point, how the strength of this evidence about the relationship between time outside and screen time, given that they're often asked in a way that is naturally there's a spurious correlation, because they're asking about traditional screen time in a television in living rooms, which naturally you won't be outside. So and there's some work in meta-analyses done probably 10, 20, 15 years ago that shows relationships between screen time and obesity, but no relationship between screen time and physical activity. So there's a very small, actually, relationship between physical activity and screen time, and there's certainly studies that show an inverse relationship, but many that show no relationship. So maybe you can comment on your review of that evidence base, but also speak to your reference from that research.
So I can certainly send you the reference to that research. I don't have it right with me, but it was basically, it was from a report, but there is conflicting evidence, as many people know, in this area for sure. And there's something to be said for people who have high screen time, but also high outdoor play or high physical activity. So do they cancel each other out? I don't think anybody really has the answer to this. These are all associations, as you've said, and as you've said too, there's oftentimes not a breakdown with regard to whether or not the screen time is TV, used for homework, tablet, phone, etc. And there's some nuance there, as Dr. Livingston spoke about as well, that might be more predictive of what's going on. So many of these studies, again, association studies with very broad outcomes that you can't really pinpoint these things. But there's a real push, at least in some of the preschooler literature, where they are moving towards wanting outdoor preschoolers and outdoor times being really, really important. And, what they call sort of non-safe, or what is it called, not dangerous play, but risky play. Risky play. I was trying to think of the word risky play, and how this can really lead to engaging with the environment, and motor development as well as social development is really important in that, and that we're losing some of that to the obscure indoor time that is spent with devices. So there's a lot of literature, not only coming out of Canada, but out of Australia and the UK about this as well. And I can certainly point the questioner to some of this literature. But as I said, depending on how it's looked at, there is conflicts. It's not all going in one direction, that's for sure.
Sonia, you may.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask you more that some of you touched upon that conflict that families face about the barriers they're facing to get outside, etc. And maybe that was going to be your response, but maybe just sort of follow up about your take around the idea of screen time displacing time for outdoor time.
So I think, I think there's so many things which are influencing families' lives and influencing families' possibilities. And there's something about this debate about screen time that makes us get kind of really close in on the child's engagement, staring at a screen, and then a whole host of different kinds of outcomes. But if we flip the question, if we didn't say, they're spending 2 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours a day on the screen, and are they overweight, or do they sleep properly, or whatever it is. If instead we ask the question the other way around and say, here's some children who don't sleep enough, and here's some children who sleep enough, or here's some children who are underweight or overweight or just right. You know, if we say, here is our problem, and if we take our time to kind of articulate what that problem is that we want to explain, then a whole set of things come into focus that are really important to understanding that problem. And at that point, screen time becomes a pretty small factor. It might be larger because it's the answer to some other things, but a lot of these problems are around poverty or family stress or just difficult circumstances. You know, if I visit families who are living in a small number of rooms up 4 flights of stairs without a lift or an elevator, and there's a baby that has a push, and you want to say, get that child out into risky play, and there's a big road in front of the block of flats. You know, I just really want us to think very carefully about the circumstances in which many families are living. And of course, I would love a world in which much more was spent on public spaces for children to play, and on the trained staff who would provide kind of educational and playful experiences around that. But given that we don't have that, I just want to say that those are the causes. Those are the causes of children's problems. And then, of course, they're stuck in a small space, often with an exhausted parent and the screens. And I would like us to think really carefully what we can advise those parents that's practical.
Great. I'm going to do that. Thank you. And so I'm going to sort of paraphrase 2 questions, one from Leon Straker over in WA in Western Australia and John Maroney. And Leon asks, comments, technology use is clearly more complex than screen time. So isn't it time for 24-hour movement guidelines to focus on sedentary time? And we need more or separate or nuanced guidelines to be provided for technology use. And I just follow up because John also asked, how do you respond to ideas of context and content of screen use versus a specific time? So both of these questions really are really challenging the idea that movement guidelines, or essentially physical activity guidelines, which combine screen time, sleep, are probably just a little too simplify the issue. So I'll start with you, Christy, about in terms of how do we need more technology guidelines versus having a less than 2-hour screen time recommendation embedded in essentially movement guidelines?
I think that's a fantastic idea. And I'm quite certain there are probably people, certainly not myself, but people who are really working on that question, because it's not all sedentary time is bad. We know that certain sedentary time is actually good for the developing brain and good for the, rest for the body, etc. But given today's digital environment, and as Sonia was saying, given the certain sort of situations that people find themselves in, I do think perhaps screen time guidelines and technology guidelines are important. So what are good, like maybe a stoplight system, which are the green light sort of things that are good, apps or educational or good screen time, digital sort of interaction that can be taking place versus bad. So maybe the violent video games are on one end of the spectrum, and the educational interactive games that require you to be engaged with a parent on the other end of the spectrum. But I really do think that this is something that we need, instead of putting all of this in the bad category, because I do believe not all of it is bad.
So I'm going to disagree, because we're having a debate, and I think, listening carefully to what you've just said, and I understand the impulse, I think what we're really saying is that we can see good reasons for children to be physically active for a certain amount of time, and good reasons for them to be socially interactive, perhaps for a certain amount of time, but anyway, that's something we want to encourage. And so it seems to me that if you want to say there should be some kind of a warning or trigger to say, you've been sedentary for a long time now, get up and move, I could understand that. And if you want to say, you've been quiet and you haven't talked to anyone for hours, go and talk to someone or interact, that would be fine too. But screens are irrelevant because what we're trying to encourage is social interaction and physical movement. And the screen might be the way that you spend your sedentary silent time, but I was one of those kids who had my nose in a book for hours and hours and hours, and I was pretty sedentary and I was pretty solitary, and I grew up to be a professor. So, you know, it's not all bad. What we're trying to encourage is the right amount of physical movement and the right amount of social interaction, and you don't need to mention the screen. And that's kind of where we got to with the under fives physical activity guidelines. We ended up saying what we need to encourage is sleep, social interaction, and physical activity.
So if you allow me to, what displaces what? You can't have it all. So if you're not going to put limits on screen time, or not going to pot it in any way, or you're not going to define this, you can't be active all the time, on screens as much as you want, sleeping as much as you want. There has to be some sort of delineation of time spent, in my opinion.
Yeah, but
I agree. I was also one of those people with my nose in a book, but I was also an elite athlete, so I had both sides. I was probably highly sedentary and highly active.
Yeah. So you see, the screen has become the means by which we engage with the world. So it's going to be, so it doesn't make sense. You know, maybe with 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, you could have an argument. Do they really need it? But
that's what we're talking about, the early years.
I know, but they've also got to learn how to engage with the digital world. And by the time they're teenagers, it's too late. They're not listening to their parents anymore. So we're trying to get some good habits in there, and we're trying to get them to be confident with digital media so that they don't get to it later and that they're anxious. So there are reasons why they want to be part of it. And my little video was trying to do a number of things. It was trying to say engaging with screens can be incredibly sociable and active. And it was also trying to say, we need to think about the family context, because the older children are using the screens, and it doesn't make sense for, it does a parent's head in to say this child can only be on for this, this one with this, because the kids are together and families are together. And today you had to talk to your cousins and your uncles and aunts. Today they have the TV on, and they will want to show this fun new thing they've found on a tablet, and they'll want to show it. And we don't want the parents to, it's just everywhere. So we need to be thinking, what are they doing on it? Are they getting enough exercise? Are they getting enough social interaction? And it's not about, things are not displacing. All of these things are happening at once.
Right. So I guess that there is a reality about screen time, and this is, I think, puts parenting in the crosshairs of what to do about this from a public health perspective. So maybe it's clearly there are some real, there are benefits and there's some real risks associated with screen time. And there's some where we see, a toddler in a stroller just holding a screen as a pacifier, if you will, versus actually engaging in a developmentally appropriate learning activity. So it's a double-edged sword for sure. So maybe as we sort of wrap up, maybe if I ask both presenters to think about what from policy or programs or practice for parenting, and Sonia's already sort of shared with us what she's done in the UK with a parenting guide, but what can we do through our educational systems or any grassroots community organizations that we can engage parents so that we clearly don't blame them and make them feel guilty because they're using screens, but use them more responsibly as well. So Christy, I'd like to maybe, obviously we're aware of the dangers, but you're also admitting, sort of considering the pragmatic issues. So how can we get more responsible use of screens?
Well, I think one of the issues that I seem to have too is when using screens, and I'll use my children as an example, you can't control, so they might be doing one thing and you can't control the advertisement and the clickbait that is also happening within an app or within a program. So what will often be happening is they're doing something that is useful, that they're learning, and then something pops up. And what pops up, we have no control over. And then they click on it, and it's not always appropriate, or something that I necessarily want them watching. And then they dive down that rabbit hole, so it can become time consuming. And I don't know who it is, I suppose the internet provider, or who it is that sort of is responsible for the programming and the advertisement that happens at the same time as whatever programming or screen app is being used. So I think that is one area, because I think that there is some danger in doing the right thing. And if you don't want to police or monitor everything that your children are doing, it would be nice to know that they're in a safe space. And I guess also there are certain programs that you can get that you can have on your computer that can screen all of that out. Myself, I'm not technologically savvy enough to do that, but I'm certain I could probably get somebody to do for me. So I think that there has to be just some monitoring to ensure that what is being viewed or what is being used is age appropriate and safe, because then we have to worry about privacy and who they're interacting with and who's seeing their information. And, you know, children don't always know what they can and cannot share when they're online, for instance. And I think that is probably, as a parent, a big concern. And I think as a researcher, that would be a big concern of mine as well.
Sonia, fairly briefly, I think our time is coming up, but if you can just maybe mention what you see as...
So I think the main thing I've tried to say is that if we don't want, I agree, we don't want kids on screens 24/7. So we need to provide alternatives, and those alternatives need to be viable, they need to be affordable, they need to be fun, and they need to be really, really local. So I think we're not spending enough on benefiting our children's lives, and we have to think about it. I think there are ways of advising and supporting parents that are more positive and more empowering. And parents are being told a lot that they are at fault. They're the ones always on their screens. They're the ones always sharing images of their children. So I think at this point, you know, we need more supportive guidance rather than constantly blaming them, and they will feel more able to take alternatives. And then the last point I would make is I agree with Christy. I'll agree at the end. I think the design of the apps and the design of the services is problematic in the way that it keeps kids on. So I would stop autoplay on YouTube, for example. I would rethink the design of games. That means that you can never interrupt, and you've always got to get to the end, and then there's another one. I think all that kind of thing, the endless notifications, this is something we need to redesign so that the digital space is supportive of children's interests and learning, and it allows them to look up and go and do something else, and then we need to make sure there is something else for them to do.
Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Might just hand it back to Anne to close the session, but I'd just like to thank Sonia and Christy for two very well researched but beautifully presented point counterpoint presentation. So it was terrific. It was definitely worth getting up at 4:30 in the morning.
Or skipping dinner for.
Yeah, thank you all so much for that. And I can just echo Stuart's thanks to you, Sonia and Christy. And thank you for getting up early, Stuart. And so yeah, that was the first webinar of this ISBNPA season. So there's another one coming up later after actually the Congress in Auckland. Keep having a look at the newsletters and Twitter feed. So we're gonna advertise it soon when it's organized. And now I just thank you, all the attendees for joining the webinar, and I wish you a good night and a good day and a good afternoon and morning to everyone.